Oh, okay. Thanks so much. All right, Guy. Thanks for joining us for the event today. Adam, thanks for joining us as well. This is Adam. He's a TikTok influencer who predominantly debates Trump supporters on live and then has also been featured in a few Jubilee videos, most notably the one where he debated Ben Shapiro and absolutely wiped the floor with him. Uh, so, Adam, if you want to go ahead and fill in any gaps that I might have made when I went ahead and introduced
I
you.
mean, yeah, you pretty much covered it. I'd say I do like political commentary from the center left. I have a Jubilee video coming up in a week as well, but mainly I do stuff on TikTok, and I'm also trying to branch out a little bit to like YouTube and Twitch as well.
All right, sounds amazing. Okay. So before I go ahead and ask the first question, I just want to say if for the audience members that do have questions, I ask that you guys wait till the last 10 minutes, so around 6:50, and then afterwards you guys can go about asking your questions. If I'm finished with the questions that I have in mind today early, then I'll open it up to the audience before 6:50. But at 6:50, you guys can go ahead and ask questions if you have any. So, Adam, I'm going to go ahead and ask you my first question. What initially inspired you to start debating political topics online, especially with Trump supporters?
I mean, I've always been interested in political debate. It's something I've been doing on and off, like since I myself was in high school. When I started taking it a little bit more seriously and making it sort of more of a career was around the time it became clear that Trump was going to be the Republican nominee for 2024 because I found him to be a very dangerous figure for the United States. And it seemed like, especially on places like TikTok, there's a big movement of young people towards Trump. I mean, he did much better than the average Republican does with young voters. So that just seemed like a super high stakes moment for me to get involved.
Okay, amazing. My next question is that, so I also sort of asked you this when we got on our first Zoom call, but you've been featured on Jubilee. What was the experience like being on it multiple times?
It's definitely interesting being kind of like behind the scenes and seeing how everything works. I mean, the main thing I can say is they have a lot of camera people, a lot of directors, and it's very micromanaged. Like even with the surrounded videos, like when everyone's running to the middle, that's all staged. Like they pick beforehand who's actually going to get to speak, and then everyone pretends to run to the middle of the circle. I also did a middle ground as well, which was the 30 versus 30. That one was a little bit different than the surrounded, but overall, I'd say they put a lot of effort and time into the production value. And typically, even when there's like people that disagree behind the scenes, everyone's nice and cordial with each other.
And then just to sort of ask a follow-up question pertaining to that, for those who are interested in potentially being on Jubilee in the future, what recommendations would you have for them? How would they go about doing that?
So they have like a casting page. That's how I first got involved. You pick a video, you give some information about yourself. You can attach a short video explaining why you think you'd be a good fit for the video. I would say it's like pretty random who they end up picking because I had applied for 3 or 4 videos before I ended up getting selected for one. And then after that one, the next one I did was the Ben Shapiro one. So the nice thing about Jubilee is once you've been in 1 or 2 videos, they kind of start reaching out to you directly for casting instead of you having to apply. But initially, I would just say be persistent, keep applying for different videos, and eventually you probably will make it.
Okay, thank you. My next question is, how have your political views changed or evolved over time? Or have you always been pretty progressive leaning?
No, I was super conservative when I was in high school. I first became involved in politics or interested in 2015 when the Republican primary was happening the first time around that Trump ran. And I was initially like a big fan of Ben Shapiro and Steven Crowder and these types of figures. I was very right leaning. And then, sort of, as I grew older, I became a little bit more libertarian leaning. In early college, I would consider myself probably a lot more far left, more of like a socialist. And then, as I got my degree in economics, I kind of moved a little bit back to the center. So I went from right to libertarian to left, and now I'm kind of center left, I'd say.
Okay, and just to kind of follow up with that, since we sort of went into the territory of your past there, did you do debate back in high school?
Yeah, I did do debate in my junior and senior year of high school.
Okay. And then my next question would be, how do you prepare for debates? Like, what does your research process look like, generally speaking, especially when tackling misinformation?
It really depends on who I'm debating. That really determines the type of strategy I want to take. So if it's like a debate on Jubilee, for example, you kind of have to be aware that like you have to be very concise. You can't ramble on because they edit stuff out if you're talking for too long, and you have to be very quick and punchy to get your point across to the viewer. So sometimes I'm not even necessarily researching as much as trying to come up with like what is the most effective, concise way I can make this point that gets across to the viewer and is not hard to understand. If I'm doing more of like a long form debate against someone else who's also an influencer and it's maybe on YouTube or TikTok, then I will be looking specifically for not just what are the points in favor of me, but what are the most common right wing talking points? Like, what are the strongest or most common arguments that the Trump supporters are going to make? And then you can kind of preemptively know how to diffuse those, and understand maybe where are the fallacies, what are they getting wrong, and be prepared with counterattacks before they even make their initial statements.
So I'm actually really happy that you brought that up because it kind of goes into the next question that I'm going to ask you. What do you think are the most common talking points that Trump supporters use in the status quo right now, and how do you typically go about countering them?
It depends a lot on the topic you're talking about. So, like, immigration is a big one. You'll typically hear people say that, like, under Biden, all these people came in illegally, and now under Trump, he's finally establishing law and order. He's kicking all these people out of our country. We need to have a process. That's what they always like to say is like, if you want to come to the country, follow the rules. And the immediate pushback to that is that a lot of the people that Trump is deporting and detaining, they did follow the rules. They applied for asylum through the CBP One app, or they were awaiting a court date to have their asylum case heard, and then Trump canceled their court dates and kicked them out. So it's not even really that they want a process to be followed. They just don't want people coming in, period, whether or not they have legitimate claims for asylum. Typically, like their talking points are pretty one dimensional. And the second you kind of push past the surface, it tends to fall apart.
So, kind of just following up with that and getting a little bit more specific. I guess I'll just use an example. How would you go about responding to the argument like, um, we need to implement the tariffs because the import tax will help us solve our deficit or help us pay off our deficit? How would you go
Yeah, I
about?
mean, there's been so many economic studies done, and if you want to raise revenue, tariffs are one of the most inefficient ways to do that. If you really want to raise revenue, you probably want to raise corporate taxes, capital gains taxes, income taxes. That's where the majority of our revenue comes from, is especially income taxes. Tariffs are number one, not great for raising revenue. Number two, they have so many other negative effects on the economy, raising consumer prices, raising production costs for domestic producers. So it's funny, they always talk about tariffs kind of making people build more in America, but if you're an American business that's building in America and you're importing things like steel or other things like drywall from Mexico, when those things are tariffed, it actually becomes more expensive then to build in America. So a lot of times these policies aren't even achieving the goals that they claim they're achieving.
I see. Okay. And then moving, and you sort of already touched on this, but kind of moving on to my next question. Are there any go-to arguments that you have that tend to be effective when debating conservatives or go-to examples?
Yeah, one thing I always like to ask people when I'm doing like the TikTok live debates is I'll first ask them, do you think that the federal indictments against Trump were a witch hunt? And then they always say yes. And then if you just ask them, okay, which charges were a witch hunt? Like, have you read the indictments? They've never, ever, ever read any of the indictments. They don't know a single one of the charges. They don't know what the January 6th case was about. They don't know what the classified documents case was about. And then where I take it a step further is there's an audio tape of Trump where he's literally confessing to showing classified documents to people without declassifying them. It's on tape, it's recorded. Most Trump supporters haven't seen that tape, but that's been the thing I've had the most success with is like, don't take my word for it. Here's Trump on tape admitting that he committed the crime.
All right. Moving on to my next question. What do you think is the best argument to prove that Trump is a threat to democracy? Now, obviously, there are a bunch of them, but what is like your go-to example or your go-to argument when it comes to him there being like a constitutional crisis or him being a
The fact that he's defying court orders, his style of governance basically has been like he won't take no for an answer. So as long as you're agreeing with him, he'll be just fine. But then when Judge Boasberg tells him you can't just ship people off to an El Salvador prison camp with no due process, instead of obliging with that, he is going through with it. And if you compare that to someone like Joe Biden, when the Supreme Court stopped him from forgiving student loans, he obliged, even though that was a policy he cared about. Whereas Trump doesn't believe in basic checks and balances. And we can't have a country of law and order or a country in general if the president starts acting like a king.
All right. And then moving on to my next question, what advice would you have for young progressives who want to engage in political debates but don't really know where to start?
I would say be very meticulous. Like first learn what people on the right are saying. I would say your media diet should consist of right wing people. You should be watching the Ben Shapiro's, the Tim Pools, the Patrick Bet Davids, just to know like what types of information and entertainment are these people consuming. And then once you have that insight into their worldview and their most common arguments, it becomes pretty easy to know like what things should I be researching, like what's worth digging deeper into. And then 9 times out of 10, when you dig deeper into it, you realize that the points they're making are either misrepresenting something or they're just straight up lies.
And then obviously, besides yourself, what other content creators or influencers would you recommend watching that are more progressive leanings that you think have good arguments to reference?
Yeah, I would say when it comes to news, I would say people like Brian Tyler Cohen, David Pakman, they do really good work. If you're a little bit more left leaning, like maybe a social democrat or socialist, Kyle Kalinske is really good. Secular Talk is a good channel on YouTube. If you enjoy debates specifically, there's obviously everyone knows Dean and Parker on TikTok. There's those two guys. There's also like smaller creators like Mason, who's also been in a few different TikTok videos with me. He goes by One Hand Politics online. There's a bunch of people, whether it's TikTok or YouTube or Twitter. And it also just really depends on like where do you stand because the Democratic Party, I think, should be ideologically diverse. There are center left people, there's people that are more far left, and depending on where you stand on these issues, there's going to be different people you want to go to for information.
All right, sounds amazing. And then I do actually have a few more questions for you, kind of just off the noggin. So,
Sure.
one thing that I've generally noticed is that whenever you're having conversations with conservatives, debating them over like social issues generally isn't pretty effective because you kind of reach this like moral foundationalist point where it's like, okay, like we just have two entirely separate principles on what we deem to be moral and not moral. So one piece of advice I've heard is like you have to prove to them that they voted against or they're supporting their or that they voted against their own self-interest essentially. So how do you generally go about doing that? Proving to them that they're supporting something that's not in their favor, that they voted against their own self-interest.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell most people, like, I think most people agree Trump won this election because of high prices. So he should technically be trying to fight that, but he's not. He's putting tariffs in place. And you should be able to tell anyone if you buy anything, if you want housing to get cheaper, everyone wants cheaper housing. We import things like drywall from Mexico. A lot of the things we import to build more homes when housing supply is already limited comes in as imports. When Trump's tariffing that, we're going to build less homes. That means if you want to buy a house one day or even rent an apartment one day, Trump's policies are making it harder for you to do that. If you care about things like free speech, Trump snatching people up like Mahmoud Khalil for expressing pro-Palestinian views. Even if, I mean, a lot of people on the right are going to say, I support that, but then you should say, okay, what happens if it's Biden and he's arresting you for being pro Russia, for example? Is that suddenly going to be okay? You have to be on the principle against people being arrested for expressing their views. So, like, free speech and economics are the two biggest ones. But even on immigration, if someone's coming here, and they want to work, why don't you want to boost the country's GDP? Why don't you want us to fill jobs that no one else is filling? The reason we have an unemployment rate that's not 0%, that means there are some jobs that aren't being worked. So it should be in your interest to fill those roles and have our economy be more productive. So whether it's immigration, economics, free speech, other social issues across the board, Trump is not, fighting in the best interest of the average person.
All right. And then kind of moving on. So I understand you're not an economist, but as somebody that got an economics degree from UMich, and you're a UMich, correct? Just
Yeah.
confirm. Um, in your opinion, what does good fiscal policy look like to you?
That's a really good question. And it seems like it's something that it seems so far away from the current things we're talking about because Trump is more focused on like, should we invade Greenland and like, how should we actually create real efficiency, not this fake efficiency that Musk is trying to create. So one thing you have to do is increase government revenues. Like the debt and deficit are somewhat important. You don't want to have your debt to GDP ratio ballooning out of control where you have like a 200% debt to GDP ratio. So that means raising probably we have long-term capital gains and short-term capital gains, raising short-term capital gains rates for sure, because you're disincentivizing speculative short-term trades, you're bringing in revenue, raising the top income brackets, people that are making over $1 million, $2 million, $5 million. There should probably be new brackets for that are at higher rates, all the way up to like probably 45, 47%. So raising taxes is one prong. The second prong is increasing spending on things like infrastructure and education. That boosts our GDP. It gives us a stronger workforce, fighting poverty. All these things are not just these sort of like liberal handouts, the way they frame it. They're good for our GDP. They give us a stronger, more well educated workforce. And then when you're increasing revenues and then you're increasing GDP, you're putting the country in a better position. That means raising taxes and raising spending at the same time.
That was an amazing answer. I guess my next question would be, and this is I don't necessarily even want to say biased, but I don't personally think there are any good arguments in favor of Trump. But if you were to go about steel manning, just conservative arguments in general, not necessarily arguments in favor of Trump, what would you say, or what would you consider to be good conservative arguments, whether it's like fiscal conservative policy or social conservative values, either one?
If it comes to social values, I guess one point that you could steelman with conservatives is that progressives are too quick to accept social change just because it's change. They want change for the sake of change, and that maybe social change, you shouldn't be against it, but you should be a little bit more careful when you're restructuring society or aspects of society that have been around for a long time. Conservatives argue that things are the way they are socially, and there's some wisdom behind that, and we shouldn't just flip things on their head overnight. When it comes to specifically economic policy, there are some economic analyses that show that when corporate taxes get too high, that can actually genuinely disincentivize investment. I would say we're nowhere close to that number where it's too high, so that's why you have to raise them. When it comes specifically to Trump, the steelman argument in favor of Trump is that there is some level of establishment corruption, and just things are just so slow. It takes so long to build a new road or a new bridge that you need someone to come in and just destroy the system as it is. That might mean that you break some things along the way, but the only way to kind of get rid of the old establishment and the old, what they call deep state, is for someone like Trump to come in and be a destructive force, I guess.
So this is sort of in the same realm of what I just asked, but I know as soon as you hopped on this Zoom call, you identified yourself as a moderate left or moderate progressive. Where do you think the progressive movement has had its faults? What disagreements do you have with people that would consider themselves far left or
I think progressives, kind of in general, and maybe this is kind of like a stereotype or caricature of progressives, like the typical Twitter progressive, does not really know how to communicate with people that don't already agree with them. So a lot of what the left has fallen into is preaching to the choir, which is great if you want people who already agree with you to agree with you more, I guess. But elections are typically won by convincing that 1.5 to 2% that might swing either which way in the national electorate to vote for you. I think there was a few million people that were Biden to Trump voters this election. I think maybe 3 million that voted Biden in 2020, voted Trump this time around. And that's because Democrats and progressives are not good at communicating what their agenda even is. A lot of, the most effective ad against Kamala this election cycle, I believe, was this Trump ad that said Kamala's in favor of they, them, and Trump is in favor of you. And, that's not to say at all that we should be throwing any marginalized groups under the bus, because we shouldn't. But when you're communicating about these types of things and you're using this like hyper academic language that no one understands, like intersectionality and like gender as a social construct, there's ways to convey those ideas to people that make more sense to them. Like one big breakdown I see specifically when it comes to trans issues is like typically when someone on the left says gender, what they actually mean to the average person is gender roles. Like how do people dress? How do they carry themselves? How do they want people to perceive them? the average person might not think of that as gender. They might think of gender more as sex, and then that's more gender roles. So like you can still convey socially progressive topics, but you have to use language that makes sense to the average person who is not on Twitter all day, who is not in progressive circles. And that does mean there has to be a little bit more openness in how you talk about these issues. But at the same time, you have to still fight for the same values. You have to still fight for working class people, marginalized people, but then do it in a way that's not coming across as condescending or like super sophisticated where it doesn't need to be.
So, kind of, or sort of shifting gears a little bit, where do you see yourself going in the future career-wise? Do you see yourself ever going into politics? Just kind of a broad question.
Yeah, that really depends on how things play out because like a year ago today, I wouldn't have expected to be where I am right now. So that's really dependent on the trajectory of what I do going forward. Ideally, I'd like to do political commentary as a long-term career. I do also have law school in the plan, so that's kind of like, whichever one of those pans out is the path that I'll end up taking. Whether I'd ever get involved in politics, I feel like it's a little presumptuous to say right now because I only have like 50,000 on TikTok. So to be saying like I'm going to run for office one day feels a little bit too distant when I'm only 23. But I definitely would be interested if the opportunity ever presented itself to pursue some kind of executive office. But again, that's a lot more going to be a function of how do things play out versus just what do I want.
Adam, I just want to let you know if you ever do run for office, you'll have my support.
Appreciate that.
Um, Sort of moving on to my next question. So, this is a topic that you've somewhat brushed over in a few of your TikTok videos and
Mm-hmm.
something that I've been meaning to bring up. So I feel like the Democratic Party is sort of having an identity crisis in the status quo. Um, and you have figures in the party like Gavin Newsom, for example, who believe that or have kind of implied that the party has gone a little bit too left leaning and we need to understand the right more. And then you have figures like AOC that believe that the party's gone way too far right and needs to shift more to the left. What's your personal stance on the direction in which the Democratic Party needs to go?
Yeah, I think both of those views are both correct and incorrect in different ways. So, Democrats, like I was just saying, need to get better at appealing to people that are center, maybe center right. That has to do a lot with language and, how you communicate with people. I think Kamala's biggest issue is that she was not the best communicator. On the stump, she gave good speeches, but sort of like impromptu, off the cuff, she was not the most convincing organic speaker like someone like Obama or Pete Buttigieg or AOC, like you just mentioned. AOC is right in the sense that I think a lot of Democrats feel disillusioned that like where are all these big policy promises? Where are these expansions of healthcare? Where is all this infrastructure that we're going to get built? So like you have to deliver left-wing promises to people, expand healthcare access, strengthen unions, strengthen public services, utilities, ports, bridges, libraries, roads. But then the way you talk about that should be more of like, you know, portray yourself as a moderate, but then pass actual progressive policy. I think that's like the best middle ground there.
So, kind of following up with that question, in your opinion, what would your presidential ticket for the Democratic Party be in 2028? Presidential.
If I had to pick off the top of my head, I would say, um, either John Ossoff or Pete Buttigieg seem like really good figures. John Ossoff, maybe I lead towards him because he is from a red state of Georgia, so that might give us an advantage. Um, I might be biased because I'm from Michigan. I like Gretchen Whitmer a lot too. It depends also on if AOC wants to run in 2028 or if she's waiting until maybe 2032 or 2036. So there's a bunch of names I'd throw in there. The main thing I'm kind of looking forward to is just a competitive Democratic primary in 2027. I just want the best man or woman to win that, whether it is someone like Gavin Newsom, who I personally would not really want to see at the top of the ticket, but he is a good communicator. If I had to pick my dream ticket, I'd probably say Buttigieg on the top of the ticket, and then maybe someone like AOC as vice president.
I'm actually happy that you brought up Buttigieg because it brings up a question that I've been meaning to ask. So, a lot of people, especially that I've personally had conversations with, have said, "I love Buttigieg, but I don't feel like he would be able to win solely because he's gay."
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that that would be a contributing factor if he ever did decide to run, and kind of cross apply the same logic to like Kamala Harris being a woman of color, for example, or AOC just being a minority woman as well. Do you
Mhm.
think these have like crucial roles to play in the election, and this goes into people's thought process, even if it's
Yeah.
unconsciously?
It's hard to know like how much these things impact people because like for example with Hillary losing and Kamala losing, I think for sure some of that probably was just sexism. The hard question is like how much of that was sexism versus other issues. That's really hard to break down because even if you do polling, no one's going to say I'm sexist. That's why I didn't vote for Kamala. That's why I didn't vote for Hillary. When it comes to Buttigieg being gay, I can see how that might possibly be an issue in maybe states like Georgia or more states like maybe Arizona. But then again, it's like how much of a difference does that make? Is it a few thousand people? Is it a few million people? I would say that probably it's not going to be as big of an issue as some people think it is, because it's not like his entire thing is I'm a gay guy. Like he doesn't really talk about it like that. He talks about the issues affecting the American people, and I tend to think that if you can give a message that resonates with people, they don't necessarily care as much about your identity. There's going to be those people that always exist, but I don't think that they can determine the outcome of elections.
Yeah, so the reason that I sort of brought that up is because after Trump's victory, I've been hearing the talking point that America is a center right country. America is a center right country. America is a center right country. Would you agree with this characterization of America, or?
Um, I think America is a very heterodox country, and there's so many conflicting poles because like even with things like healthcare, if you ask people, should the government provide everyone health insurance, everyone says yes. And then if you ask them, should government abolish private health insurance, everyone says no. And those are kind of the same thing. So it's like it's kind of hard to pin down, is America center right, center left? I feel like America on the aggregate is probably center. And then on certain issues, they're more left. On certain issues, maybe they're more right. Um, Overall, it also comes down a lot more to like rhetoric. So maybe like rhetoric wise, America might like center moderate, center right language more. But when it comes to actual policy, the most popular things the government does are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So in terms of policy, they're probably more center left.
I see. And then, sort of moving on to my next question, and this pertains a little bit more to current events. Do you believe that Chuck Schumer should have came out and said Democrats need to vote for this continuing resolution or this budget proposal, or do you think the government should have shut down, in your opinion?
No, I think that was Chuck Schumer is an embarrassment for that. I think even people center left, far left, everyone's kind of agreeing that he fully kowtowed to Trump. He fully submitted himself to Trump when he didn't need to do it. He claims that like I wanted to prevent a government shutdown because when the government shuts down, it becomes a lot easier for Trump and Musk to start chopping away at the government, firing civil servants. And that is true. But I think the big issue Democrats are going to have is like when Trump and his people try to, excuse my language, like fuck up the country. You have to let them do it so that they actually bear the responsibility for that. If Democrats keep bailing them out and helping them save face, then the average person is never going to fully understand the risk that Trump poses. So I think that Schumer is right that things would have gotten bad if the government shut down. But I would say you have to let them get bad and let people see that this is Trump's fault. Let Trump own it, and then do that instead of Democrats, helping them clean up the mess every single time.
Okay. Sort of shifting gears a little bit, do you believe that after the Trump administration, um, or even now in the status quo, like right now, U.S. hegemony is essentially gone?
It depends on what you're if you're talking about economically or militarily or culturally. I think culturally speaking, the US still does have hegemony, like our music, our shows, like there's probably people in Vietnam listening to the new Playboy Cardi album. Like that's just American culture is like our biggest export. When it comes to militarily, we're definitely losing that status. I mean, a lot of these NATO countries now are starting to think about a world order where America is not the security guarantor of Europe. There's pros and cons to that. Maybe it is a good thing that Western European countries are going to become more self-sufficient so that a crazy leader like Trump can't just, completely throw a wrench into things. On the other hand, that means we have less economic influence, less military influence, things like tariffs. Trump is tearing up the USMCA, which is his own trade deal that he said was a beautiful, amazing trade deal. Now his tariffs void that same trade deal. So like a lot of countries now, same with the Iran deal, he tore that up. Like I think America's word is not going to be taken very seriously anymore when all these deals we've made, all these promises we've made can just be overturned overnight. But I still do think that culturally speaking, America is the hegemon. I do think that's the most important thing.
Okay. And then since we're sort of on the topic of foreign policy right now, I wanted to go ahead and ask. So I think we can both agree that Trump's rhetoric and through his actions as well, he's sort of just been bending the knee to Putin. I mean, we voted with them on a UN resolution to condemn Russian aggression. Um, what, in your opinion, would be the ideal way to solve or go about solving the Ukraine Russia conflict?
Yeah, the answer that I would give to this question today is different than what I would have given maybe a year and a half ago. So I actually think that Biden did not send Ukraine enough military aid. Everything that I've seen says that they would ask for something, they'd get it 4 months late, and then they wouldn't get the quantity they needed. So I think we kind of put Ukraine in a weird position where they had just enough to keep a stalemate or to get pushed back very, very slowly, but not enough to actually push Russia back out of their territory. So I would say initially just send a lot more to Ukraine a lot earlier on and be a lot more dynamic and responsive with the aid. With that being said, where we currently are, that seems a lot less tenable and a lot less realistic. So I would say my perfect outcome here, which perfect is maybe not the best word because the fact that Russia would get any concessions is not ideal at all. I would say that probably it would be something like force Putin to say, okay, you guys can keep Crimea, but then everything post 2022 goes back to Ukraine. If Putin doesn't agree with that, whatever the land split ends up being, I think Ukraine needs to join NATO. I think this never would have happened if Ukraine was in NATO in the first place. As much as people say NATO is causing Russian aggression, a bunch of countries, most countries on Russia's western border are already in NATO. And it just so happens those are the countries Russia is not invading, they're not messing with. The two countries that Russia does mess with are Belarus and Ukraine, the two countries not in NATO. So I'd say the biggest priority to me is getting whatever Ukraine is, whatever those lines are, to be in some kind of security agreement with the West. And then, with that being said, ideally territory wise, I would want them to reclaim Donetsk, Luhansk, like all these eastern Ukrainian territories. How easy is that to do? I don't know, because I don't know if Ukraine can really push Russia back anymore. Because no one in Ukraine really seems to want to fight. All the polling shows that people want a peace deal. So we can't really force them to keep fighting if they don't want to. So I would say the unfortunate thing is going to be land distribution, but whatever that ends up being, security guarantees are a must.
So just to sort of ask some clarifying questions about Russia, Ukraine specifically, or even more specifically, the aid that we've been sending to Ukraine. So Trump's been going on TV and saying that we've been sending $350 billion or something around that range. Just to clarify, it was 120 billion, and then we were sending it through USID, I'd assume. And then was it in the form of old weapons and
Yeah.
guaranteed loans, or just
It
old
was a
weapons?
mix of direct monetary aid, weapons, and then some loans. The majority, or at least a plurality of that, was just weapons and military equipment. A lot of that military equipment was stuff that wasn't even brand new, state of the art. Where some of the tanks we sent them, I think, are like Soviet era tanks. So like the idea that we've given them anywhere close to 300 billion in cash, which is what Trump tries to imply, is nowhere near true. And then also you have to view it as like we're spending money on a geopolitical interest of the US. It's not just like we're lighting it on fire.
And then sort of something that's been a hot topic for a while, and still within the realms of foreign policy. What's your ideal stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict and the way in which the U.S. should be addressing that issue?
Yeah, so this is one area where I was extremely critical of Joe Biden, and I'm even more critical of Trump on this. I don't think we should be enabling what's taking place right now in Gaza. It shouldn't be hard to say that we condemn October 7th, but then we also condemn the killing of innocent civilians in Gaza, women, children, the elderly, the destruction of the vast majority of the cities that are there. Um, Even if you don't care about the ethics of it, purely from a strategic point of view, why are we making the Middle East hate the US so much? Like, obviously, they're going to hate us. Obviously, terror groups are going to become more popular when they can point to a destroyed hospital or a destroyed school or the body of a 3-year-old kid and say, like, look what the US has done. It shouldn't be rocket science to figure out maybe this is why there's so much resentment against the West in these regions. So even from a pure foreign policy, realpolitik standpoint, we shouldn't be enabling these types of military operations. With that being said, I think Hamas is a problem and they oppress the people of Gaza themselves. So, like, the question then becomes, how do you take out a group like Hamas? How do you establish a two-state solution with Palestinian sovereignty and security both for the people of Gaza, the people of the West Bank, and the people of Israel? That's a very complicated question that people much smarter than me have tried to figure out, like Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter. It seems pretty hard to do right now, but I would say the biggest thing to me and the most immediate thing to me is that we should not be providing any kind of military aid or support. And on top of that, should be considering even sanctions on Israel if they are responsible for the death of tens of thousands of innocent people.
So one, and just to get your opinion on it, so one argument that I've heard sort of somewhat in opposition to this is that this idea that U.S. intervention in Israel's military pertaining to like attacks on Palestine and Gaza has actually deterred like Israeli aggression. And if we weren't involved, Israel would be a lot more aggressive when attacking Palestine or Gaza.
That might be true in the sense of, like, if we're only considering are we giving them aid or not. That's why I also mentioned sanctions. I think the US needs to flex its power on trying to put pressure on Israel. We should be saying that if you want to be allied with the US, there's certain conditions you have to meet in terms of how you conduct yourself in a humanitarian way. So, like, it might be true that, like, if we just said we're cutting off military aid, that Israel would say, okay, we're just going to go harder now with our own military stuff. But then if we're combining that with, like, no, we're going to also consider sanctions the way that Biden already sanctioned, like, West Bank settlers, for example. If we expanded that to people that are maybe top ranking military officials and said, if you're going to conduct yourself in this way, there's going to be consequences to pay. That's where I think America does have a lot of influence on Israel. Would that be maybe popular in Israel or with people that are maybe more pro Zionist in the US? Maybe not, but I think it's like a moral question.
I see. And then my last question before I go ahead and open it up to if Zayed or Braden have any, it's just what do you think or how do you think our media environment needs to change domestically speaking?
Yeah, I mean, currently MAGA is the mainstream in media. They are Fox News, which is the biggest cable news channel. Then there's all the biggest YouTube channels are right-leaning, if not just blatantly MAGA aligned. So I think having more of a presence just in terms of volume, more people should be doing content creation. We need more podcasts. We need more people who are like, um, there's a big thing the right has where people will say, I'm not political. I dislike both parties, like people like Joe Rogan. But then they'll say, I dislike both parties. I think that Kamala Harris is the devil. And then I think Trump is kind of mean sometimes. And that's them criticizing both parties equally when clearly they're kind of being a lot more harsh on one than the other. I think we need more pop culture figures who are more culturally aligned with the Democrats and their priorities more so, like funding education, funding healthcare, versus just a Democratic Party label specifically. You have to be more tied to the issues. With that being said, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, where Democrats need to get better at not just preaching to the choir. I do want people like Pete Buttigieg going on Joe Rogan and pushing back if he says something wrong. Going on the Ben Shapiro show, Patrick Bet David, go on these shows and fight these people when they're wrong and sort of like stand up for yourself and have more of a spine instead of just being in your own echo chambers. And then just on top of all that, I would say, like, there needs to be more of a cultural shift in the Democratic Party, where right now it feels to many to be the party of the sort of like academia elites and like rich suburban white people. That's kind of like the vibe that people get. And there needs to be more of a shift towards, like, we're just normal people who want people to have healthcare and education. And that does come with like a shift in language and media strategy.
All right. Zayed, Braden, do either of you have any specific questions for him?
Yeah, I'll wait for Zayed.
It doesn't seem like Zayed has a question, or at least not now. You can go ahead and ask.
Okay, yeah. Hey Adam, I love your lives. I'm in there all the time.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask, um, Is there a certain, or I have this in one follow up. Is there a certain school of economics that you follow, like in terms of Keynesian, Marxist, Austrian, Chicago, classical?
Yeah, I would say probably mostly Keynesian. I mean, that's kind of also what they tended to teach, at least where I got my economics degree. Austrian economics to me does not make much sense. And then Marxist economics or like post-Keynesian is like a little bit too left for me. There might be some individual things from different schools that I might find validity in, but I guess overall speaking, I would probably say I'm Keynesian.
Yeah. And then I'll ask, what form of Keynesian do you follow? Because I know this neoclassical post, as you said.
Um, Maybe some mix of neo and classical. I mean, like post is like a lot of the modern monetary theory stuff, which I feel like is a little bit misguided in like how far exactly it's willing to go with printing money and racking up debt. I tend to go number one. I would say it's important to realize that even with Keynesian economics, like economics in the real world is almost never how it's presented in theory because there are so many confounding factors like inelastic supply and demand and barriers to entry and like concentration of market power that I would say like the best way to really understand economics is to look at actual empirical studies. Like, for example, a big thing that I'm passionate about is like increasing the supply of housing. You don't just have to go to economic theory for that. They've started, getting rid of zoning laws in some parts of Texas. I think in Austin or Houston, and rents have started collapsing as a result of that. So there's a lot of like real world application that I think can transcend some of these like labels of different schools of thought.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Sorry, I want one more.
Sure.
How do you feel? Because I know he would be my presidential contender. I don't know if his terms would allow him to, but I just feel like he would have the most outreach. Andy Bashir, how do you feel about Andy?
I think that's the Kentucky governor, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just watching an interview he did. I forgot with who. Maybe it was John Favreau or something. I think he'd be great. I think getting a Democrat from a red state is probably the way to go for 2028. Whether that is like Warnock or Ossoff or someone like Bashir, that might really help us with because those people know how to communicate in environments that are not favorable. And I think that's like a really important skill.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much.
Mhm.
All right. Isaiah, do you have any specific questions? Okay. It seems like he does not. Adam, I truly do appreciate you coming on and
Yeah, thanks for having
speaking.
me.
Um, I've been watching your content for I think about a year now, give or take, maybe a little bit less than that. And I'll literally use your talking points whenever I'm having discussions with people. You're one of the more competent content creators that I see making progressive
Appreciate that.
arguments on TikTok and social media in general. I really hope you just have that one moment where you blow up, which would be so well deserved, and you just like hit 5 mil. Um, because I truly do believe you're having just as much of an impact as a lot of the more um bigger creators, young influencers like Dean and Parker and Harry and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So
I
I
really
truly do
appreciate that.
appreciate you coming on.
Yeah. Thanks for having me again.
All right, we're gonna go ahead and end it off. Okay, bye, Adam.
All right. Bye.